This place was the beginning of the end for my family. A dragon is not a slave.
Game of Thrones foreshadowed the end of House of the Dragon when Daenerys revealed what happened during one of the most shocking moments in the Dance of the Dragons. In Season 7 of Game of Thrones, Daenerys was finally able to set foot inside of the massive dragon pit, a historical location that was once the home of her family's dragons for nearly a century. In 45 AC, shortly after all the work was done on the Red Keep, Maegor ordered the construction of the dragon pit, which he called a great stone stable for dragons. It would be nearly a decade before the dragons were able to live inside the enormous dome castle that sat on Rhaenys Hill. It now sits abandoned over a century and a half after the Dance of the Dragons. When Dany and Jon were there, they discovered some of the skeletal remains of one of the small dragons who was once locked inside. It's a reminder of how this was the beginning of the end for House Targaryen. As you saw in that scene, Daenerys said, "A dragon is not a slave." They should have never had them locked inside the dragon pit where they would waste away and ultimately shrink in size. At the end of House of the Dragon, we will see a horrifying event known in the histories as the storming of the dragon pit. It's a disturbing moment in Westerosi history when madness and mayhem filled the streets of King's Landing. We will see thousands of small folk force their way inside and slaughter 5 of House Targaryen's dragons. It happens near the end of the Dance of the Dragons after Rhaenyra sits the Iron Throne and the small folk have gone mad in the city. They have been foreshadowing this in House of the Dragon when they've shown different scenes of the small folk rioting in King's Landing. This happens not only because of the lack of food, but also because of the growing fear of the dragons attacking the city. In Fire and Blood it says, no longer believing Rhaenyra could save them, the small folk then looked to a man known as the Shepherd for their salvation. They were deathly afraid of the dragons, and the Shepherd had them believing they would all burn alive unless they did something about it first. The Shepherd said, "This is the Dragon City. If you would make it yours, first you must destroy them. If you want to wash yourself of sin, first you must bathe in dragon's blood, for only blood can stop the fires of hell." That's when thousands of small folk began shouting, "Kill them, kill them, kill them." They began shoving everyone in front of them, while brandishing swords and knives and other weapons. As soon as word had reached her that the Shepherd's savage flock was on the march, Rhaenyra sent riders to the gates in the city, demanding them to stop the small folk, arrest the Shepherd, and defend the dragons. However, the city was in such disarray, it was far from certain that the riders had won through. Even if they did, what loyal men remained was not enough to have any real hope of success. "They will kill the dragons," Joffrey said. "Or the dragons will kill them," said Rhaenyra. "Let them burn." Rhaenyra did not believe they could defeat the dragons. "They are vermin," she said. "They're drunks and fools and gutter rats. As soon as they see the dragon flame, they will run." The Shepherd's men were armed with long axes, swords, knives, and 100 other kinds of weapons, including longbows and crossbows. Now, the City Watch did what they could, but soon found themselves unable to cut through the mobs and turn back. The Dragon Pit itself did have its own guards, the Dragon Keepers, however, there were only 77 of them, and fewer than 50 had watch on that night. Though their swords drank deep of the blood of the attackers, the numbers were against them. When the Shepherd's men smashed through the doors, the Dragon Keepers were overwhelmed and soon slaughtered. Mayhaps the attackers hoped to take the dragons within while they slept, but all the noise of the assault made that impossible. Those who lived to tell the tales afterwards speak of the shouts and screams, and the smell of the blood in the air, and the splintering of oak and iron doors beneath the rams and the blows of countless axes. Seldom have so many men rushed so eagerly to their death, Grey Maester Munkin wrote, but a madness was upon them. There were 4 dragons housed within the dragon pit. All 4 of the dragons were awake and angry by the time the first of the attackers entered. No one knows exactly how many men and women died that night under the dragon pit's great dome. It might have been hundreds or thousands, who's to say. For every man who died, a dozen more suffered burns and yet survived. Unfortunately, the dragons could not fly away. They were stuck inside, hemmed in by the walls and the dome, and bound by heavy chains. They were not able to use their wings to evade attacks and dive down on their foes. Instead, they fought with their horns and razor-sharp claws and teeth. And lastly, these dragons would unleash their fire. The dragon pit was transformed into a fiery hell where burning men staggered screaming through the smoke, the flesh falling from their blackened bones. For every man who died, a dozen more arrived, shouting that the dragons must needs die. And one by one, they did. Shrykos was the first dragon to die, slain by a woodsman known as Hob the Hewer, who leapt onto her back, driving his axe down into the dragon's skull. It was written that a dragon named Morgul was slain by a burning knight, a giant man in heavy armor who rushed headlong into the dragon's flame while holding a spear in hand. He began thrusting it into the dragon's eye over and over again as the dragon flame melted the steel armor and devoured the flesh within. Joffrey's dragon Tyraxes went back into its lair, we are told, roasting so many would-be dragon slayers as they rushed after him that its entrance was soon made impassable by their dead bodies. But it must be remembered that each of these man-made caves had an entrance in the front and back. It was the shepherd himself who directed his followers to break through the back door. Hundreds of men did, howling through the smoke with swords and axes. Now, as Tyraxes turned, his chains entangled him in a web of steel that fatally limited his movement. Half a dozen men and one woman would later claim to have dealt the dragon the mortal blow. The last of the 4 dragons did not die so easily. Legend has it that Dreamfire had broken free of her chains. As the men rushed after her, Dreamfire took flight, circling the cavernous interior of the dragon pit and swooping down to attack the men below. It's said that Dreamfire killed more men than the other 3 dragons combined. Hundreds of men fled in fear of her flames, but hundreds more, drunk or filled with madness, began to attack. Even as Dreamfire flew near the top of the dome, the dragon was still within easy reach of archer and crossbowmen, and arrows flew at her wherever she went. Some of the arrows even sunk deep into her scales. Whenever she lighted, men would swarm to the attack, driving her back into the air. Unable to flee, Dreamfire again went on the attack, savaging enough men until the sands of the floor were littered with burnt bodies, and the very air thick with smoke and the smell of melted flesh. Yet the arrows still flew. The end came when one of the crossbow bolts grazed the dragon's eye. Now she was half blind, and maddened by a dozen lesser injuries. That's when Dreamfire spread her wings and flew straight up at the great dome above in a last desperate attempt to break into the open sky. Already weakened by dragon flame, the dome cracked under the force, and a moment later half of it came down, crushing both the dragon and dragon slayers under the broken stone and rubble. The storming of the dragon pit was done. 4 of the Targaryen's dragons lay dead, though at hideous cost. Yet the shepherd was not satisfied, for Rhaenyra's dragon remained alive and free. And as the burned and bloody survivors came stumbling from the smoking ruins, Syrax descended on them from above. 1,000 shrieks and screams echoed across the city. Rhaenyra herself wrapped her arms around her last living son, Aegon the Younger, holding him fiercely. Nor would she loose her hold upon him until that dread moment when Syrax fell. Unchained and riderless, Syrax might have easily flown away from the madness. The sky was hers after all. She could have returned to the Red Keep, left the city entirely, or went to Dragonstone. Was it the noise and the fire that drew her to the Hill of Rhaenys, the screams of the dying dragons, or the smells of the burning flesh? We cannot know. No more than we can know why Syrax decided to descend on the shepherd's flock, devouring dozens when she might have easily have rained fire on them from above. For in the sky, no man could have harmed her. We can only say what happened as Mushroom, Septime Stace, and Grand Maester Munkin have set it down for us. There's many different stories regarding the death of Rhaenyra's dragon Syrax. The Grand Maester says Hob the Hewer killed Syrax with his axe, though this is almost certainly mistaken. Could the same man have really slain 2 dragons on the same night in the same manner? There are some who say there was an unnamed man, a blood-soaked giant who leapt from the dragon pit's broken dome onto the dragon's back. Others relate how a knight named Sir Wheaton slashed a wing from Syrax with a Valyrian steel sword. A crossbowman would later claim the kill. However, the story most often heard in King's Landing named the shepherd himself as the Dragon Slayer. As others fled, the story went, the one-handed shepherd stood fearless and alone against the dragon. In his hand was a black blade made of smoke that turned to steel as he swung it, striking off the head of Syrax from her body. And so the tale was told, even by Septime Stace in his account of these dark days, and so the singer sang for many years thereafter. On this night, 5 dragons lay dead, with the dragon pit now in ruins. By the end of the Dance of the Dragons, only 4 remained alive. The wild cannibal, who was never ridden, Sheep Stealer, who was hiding in the Mountains of the Moon with its rider, Silverwing, who had gone feral after the death of her rider and her mate, and the young dragon Morning, who had hatched during the war. After their extinction, the only remnants of the dragons were their bones, their skulls, and their eggs, which eventually turned to stone over time. Daenerys was right when she said this was the beginning of the end for her family. House Targaryen and their dragons would never be the same. We will see the fall of this great dynasty in House of the Dragon, when they inevitably bring their self and their dragons on the verge of extinction after the war.